In this video, what I'm going to do is start digging into the Theaetetus. Now, the Theaetetus in this video will be just the beginning of it, namely 142a to 143c, sometimes called the framing dialogue. And the framing dialogue comes in two parts. Namely, it's a small little discussion between two characters named of Euclides and Terpsion, and it, as the name suggests, it frames the main dialogue, which is between Socrates and this young, basically this kid, kind of like a high school kid, named Theaetetus, for whom the entire dialogue is named. So let's look at this little framing dialogue, and as I said, it comes in two parts. Part one is the street scene, still not very long, and then part two is even shorter. It's a brief interlude at Euclides' house. So the framing dialogue takes place in about 369 BC, so we're about 30-ish years after Socrates' death, and the main dialogue itself, that's embedded in this framing dialogue, takes place at around 399 BC. So you got to get used to this structure of sort of the nested boxes, if you like, of how Plato presents this. And keep in mind that this is all part of Plato's methodology in writing to put the ideas in certain orders. So don't neglect the fact that Plato has this kind of embedding structure, and he talks a lot about memory. So all the themes are going to be related, in fact, to the structure of the dialogue as well. And because Plato he's an excellent writer, an excellent dramatist. He doesn't do things unless he has a reason for it. So it's all part to propel the narrative of the dialogue forward and the ideas that he's trying to get across. Now, we are in the street scene of Megara. Megara is a small town, not too far from Athens, and in this case, it's famous for its scholars of logic. So Megara is known for logic. And Euclides is a logician of the time. So Terpsion and Euclides are residents of this little town of Megara. Euclides is an older contemporary. So Euclides is an older contemporary of Plato. Euclides also was a student of Socrates. So he was one of the guys that would be hanging around with Socrates as Socrates went around the streets of Athens and talked to people or talked to friends. Euclides would have been in that crowd along with Plato. Now, Euclides founded a school of logic in Megara, and he has been recently down to the riverbank, down at Megara's harbor, and has just returned. Terpsion has been traveling around the countryside, and he has just was looking for Euclides as he came into Megara, and he was looking for him in the market. All right, and so when Euclides gets back from being down at the riverside, down at the riverbank, he happens to meet Terpsion on the street, and they start talking. And Euclides tells Terpsion that he just saw this great soldier, mathematician, which is Theaetetus. Now, Theaetetus, remember, in the dialogue is a kid, but this is some 30 years afterwards. So Theaetetus is a grown man, and he is a soldier. He's been in a couple of battles, and he's on his way home from Corinth, another city, and he's on his way home. He's passing through Megara, through the port of Megara. He's rushing to get home to Athens because he's been wounded, and he's suffering from dysentery, and he wants to go home. Euclides says to Terpsion, after seeing Theaetetus, and, I'm on my way back up the river, I left the port, I see Theaetetus, and I started have this, kind of reminiscing And what does he reminisce about? He reminisces about this conversation that he was present at many years earlier when Theaetetus was a kid, was like a high school kid, and Socrates struck up a conversation with him in a gymnasium. So he's like, yeah, I was just thinking about this old conversation I had heard between Socrates and Theaetetus. You know, seeing Theaetetus now as a grown man, he's a soldier, he's been injured in war. He was also recognized as a pretty good mathematician. So I was thinking about him when he was a kid, talking to Socrates about mathematics and knowledge and all this stuff. So we have this, first off, the structure is kind of a flashback. Think about, you're remembering something. So there's a bit of a distancing effect with that because the main dialogue is the result of Euclides thinking about a conversation that he wasn't engaged in, but he was present at. Now, so, Terpsian then says, oh, well, that sounds pretty cool. Right? Euclides, you were, listening to Socrates talk to this Theaetetus guy, and Theaetetus is a respected mathematician. So Socrates, this great philosopher that we all remember, what did he say to this kid? And this kid was a prodigy at the time. Theaetetus was recognized as an up-and-coming mathematician. He was studying with a great geometer named Theodorus, or Theodorus, however you want to pronounce it. And so, Terpsian's pretty excited about this. He says, what are we going to do? Well, Terpsian says, I want you to tell me about this discussion. So Euclides goes on to note that, after I heard this conversation, so we're still in the framing dialogue, and he's talking about this conversation that he heard years ago. He said, after I heard this conversation with Socrates and Theaetetus, and I went home and I started writing down what I could remember. I was writing down as fast as I could all the stuff that Socrates had said, and then I would write it down, and then I would go visit Socrates and say, is this right? Did I get this right? And so they would go through what Euclides had written, and Socrates would add some things or take some things out. So again, think about it. We've got another instance of memory. So it's the memory of going back. Yeah, this is what I wrote about the exchange that I witnessed. But then, I went afterwards and said to Socrates, "Is that what you said?" So now Socrates' memory is playing a role. So it's clearly distancing itself from the original conversation. So memory is key here. Memory is an important one. So Plato is trying to get you to be thinking about memory and its role in what we mean when we talk about knowledge. All right, so we have a number of conversations between Euclides and Socrates about Socrates' conversation with Theaetetus. That had occurred just a little while earlier. And then eventually it's all wrapped up in this much later version of the main dialogue that Euclides is eventually going to present to Terpsian. All right, so this conversation, this street conversation, they're chatting a little bit about this, so Euclides is setting things up for us. And now think about what happened when this main dialogue, right, this encounter between Socrates and Theaetetus, this is in 399 BC. So what's about to happen? Well, Socrates is under a lot of stress because things are going rather badly for him, and the trial is coming. Socrates has been accused. So the fact that Socrates is not going to be around much longer certainly would have weighed on his mind, because he was about to go on trial for all kinds of things, corrupting the youth and a number of issues that the Athenians were worried that he was up to, and he was going to be put to death very shortly after this encounter, this discussion he has with the young Theaetetus. So Euclides says, so back to Euclides in the framing dialogue, he says to Terpsian, I think I got it. I think I got the dialogue as well as I could. I'm pretty sure I got it all, but I don't claim that it's perfect. So the best that memory can do. So memory is, clearly important, but it's fallible, but it plays a role. So this can lead into questions of what does certainty mean, and where does memory derive? How are there different kinds of memory, right? Because there's the memory, that we have of all different ways that it functions in our experience. So Plato's opening that question up. Right? You remember, when you think of many things, sometimes you have visual memories, like if you go to an event and you have a visual memory, like you go to a concert or something. And when I say, think about your experience at a concert, you might say things like, oh yeah, I remember when the singer did something, or when the guitarist did a solo or whatever. And you might have a very visual memory of that, and an audio visual, right? Yeah, I can still hear and see that guitar solo in my mind. So that's a very kind of, shall we say, an audio visual memory. And then you might have all kinds of other memories that are a little bit different, in the sense that you might say, yeah, I remember they did these 7 songs, but oddly enough, in your memory, you may not have an audio-visual component to go along with it. It's like, yeah, I know they played that song. It's kind of an obscure song. I don't actually have a audio-visual memory, but I remember them playing it. So this opens up the question of when you say, yeah, I remember that, whatever expression, I remember that incident in the form of a audio-visual memory. I remember it as a fact. Yeah, I remember that they played that song, but I'm not able to kind of call up an actual image of them playing it in the way that I could recall an image of the great guitar solo I saw, or something like that. So the point is that memory is important, it plays a role, and memory is complex. And Plato's going to introduce other kinds of memory that we normally don't think of, and that will be treated in later videos, in later discussion, when he uses the midwife analogy. That we have other kinds of memories that that are not sourced in everyday experience. For instance, you have everyday experience gives you memories of the guitar solo, but in your mind, Plato's going to start talking, Socrates, as his mouthpiece here, is going to start talking about other kinds of concepts that we have in our memory that are not derived from experience. And that's going to be a key point in the dialogue as well. But that's getting a little bit ahead of the story. So Plato often, in his dialogues, likes to have characters sort of kickstart the dialogue as they walk back from a port. Right? The most famous example is in the Republic, when they're all strolling back. They've been out watching some events down in the port, and why is a port? Why is it sort of used as a structural device or a setting for Plato? Well, there's a lot of reasons why, and some of them are arguably speculative. But one thing about port cities is they were places of trading and exchange, right? So ships would come in and people would trade goods. And not only do people, when they get together to trade physical objects, they also trade ideas, right? So new ideas come in and they're circulated. And if you look at the history of port cities, in addition to simply being places of wealth, which a lot of places that were founded on port cities, like Athens, London, a number of them, eventually developed quite large empires. So it's not, I wouldn't say it's a sufficient condition, but certainly it seems to be a necessary condition for the growth of wealth, both in terms of economic goods and knowledge, that you have places of interchange, and port cities fit that bill quite nicely. So it links, so using port cities or ports as a beginning, shows how Plato can link his dialogues up, and it provides a metaphor, the marketplace, if you like, the marketplace of ideas. All right, so Terpsichore then says, okay, so you've jotted this manuscript down, you've talked to Socrates about it, this is pretty interesting. Tell me what's in it, right? What did you write? What happened? I'm quite fascinated by this conversation that you had. And so do you have it off? Can you tell me what's in it right now? And Euclides says, oh, no, I don't have that. Now, we'll have to go to my place and we'll have to look at it because I don't have the entire dialogue, the manuscript of the dialogue. So remember, this main dialogue is a manuscript that he constructed, but I certainly don't, says Euclides, have that committed to memory. We're going to have to go to my place where I have the actual manuscript. And in that sense, is Plato making other suggestions about how you do philosophy, serious philosophy? Is it something you do when under more leisurely conditions, or is it something you do in your spare time, or is it something that actually can be done, in the actual structure of the conversation? And so there's places of tension in Plato's writings about the role of writing versus the role of, shall we say, live speech. So these are things that we can be thinking about. Again, always I'm of the view that Plato doesn't put things in his dialogue that he doesn't intend for us to reflect on and wonder what they're there for. He doesn't just put stuff in a dialogue for no reason. So I admit that that's a presupposition that I have about Plato. I take him very seriously, and all the devices that are in there, I think, serve a purpose. All right, so Euclides says, all right, Terpsian, I've got the manuscript at home. Come over to my place, and we'll read the manuscript. And what he says, though, is he says, come over to my place, and we're going to read the manuscript, but actually, at my house, one of my slaves is going to read the manuscript. So we'll sit there. So at Euclides' house, Euclides and Terpsian, they will listen to a slave read the manuscript. So in that sense, we've got Euclides and Terpsian now, they're kind of like a little audience. So Plato has set this up with a dramatic structure now. Euclides and Terpsian and you and me and all of us, we are now invited to sit back and listen to this dialogue as if it's kind of like a play. But it's not going to be a play for the Greeks, well, we could go into this in a lot more detail. The Greeks didn't see art like a play just for the sake of entertainment. Right? A play was supposed to be edifying. You watched plays, you listened to music and concerts as a kind of educational experience, right? You listen to music to purge the emotions, change the emotions, to maybe bring you to a place of where you've purged emotions and you have a better understanding or a clearer mind of things. Aristotle talks a lot about this in the Poetics of what the elements of drama should do to the soul. They should move it and teach it and bring it to new places. They should move the soul. So we're not just listening in that sense. So let's put that in scare quotes. I mean by listen, to engage. So we are going to engage in this dramatic production. You're going to be sitting there and listening and thinking and trying to interact a little bit with the text by questioning it and seeing what answers you get back from it. So today we might say this is like an involved reading, right? So what we're going to do is try to engage as much as we can with the text. Now, notice this also. Here we're having a slave reading the manuscript. Now, there's another dialogue of Plato's called the Meno, where a slave plays an important role. The slave plays an important role in the Meno in terms of education and knowledge, and how a slave can come to something with supposedly no knowledge, and yet Socrates is able to reveal that the slave has, without being educated, has some kind of knowledge in him or her. In the Meno case, it's a slave boy. So in the Meno case, the slave is revealed as not being trained, but somehow has mathematical knowledge in him. So where does that knowledge come from? That ties back to what I said earlier about the different kinds of memory. And remember I said there's memory that comes along from experience. You went to the rock concert, you went to the concert, and you remembered stuff about it. But memory in the Meno is talked about is not being derived from experience, but kind of implanted, right? So memories that are there from when you're born. In other words, innate memories, right? Things that are just there that you didn't learn by experience. You just were born, as we say, born with it. You were born knowing certain things. So there are certain kinds of concepts. This will be discussed in much more detail in a later video when we talk about the midwifery example, right? The notion of giving birth and the role of the philosopher is analogous to that of a midwife. So, and that will tie in to the notions of memory, regular memory, experiential memory, and the special memory of innate memories. Now, the other thing that's interesting, in addition to tying different dialogues together via the structure of having a slave doing something, is the fact that a slave, look at this, a slave could read the manuscript. So the slave could read. Now, this is another thing I want you to think about. What does this really mean? To say that the slave is going to read the manuscript, right? Now, think about this. Let's say I give you a passage that's written in ancient Greek, in the letters that you may not recognize of ancient Greek. You probably couldn't make heads or tails out of that unless you were trained in it, but supposing you weren't. You couldn't in any way read it. But if I gave you a passage, let's say you don't speak German. But if I give you a passage that's written in German, you probably could, if you can read English, you could probably kind of sound it out loud. And a native speaker or someone who speaks German, if you read it out loud, you may not have a clue what you read. But the German speaker would be able to tell you, let's say the German speaker could speak English, could then say, oh, well, yeah, I could tell, maybe you read it out with poor pronunciation or whatever, but the German speaker probably could say what you read out loud. In other words, the German speaker could capture or grab hold of the meaning that you actually could not, even though you read it out loud. So in other words, what's going on with the slave reading the manuscript? Is there any kind of knowledge going on here? Because if the German speaker said, oh, actually, what you read out was, a passage from, a famous passage from a novel or something like that about somebody driving a car. And you might say, man, I had no idea. It was just a bunch of noise. I just read it out because I don't understand the language. But all of a sudden, the other person hears these sounds and they say, no, that actually has meaning that goes along with it. So this other aspect is important, is that meaning is going to be different than just simply the sound of the language. Because, yeah, you could hear, like right now, you're hearing all my words in English, all the sounds, but I'd like to think that you're not concentrating on the sounds or the way my voice happens to sound, the pitch of it or anything. You're getting the meaning. Whereas if someone was listening to this who did not speak any English, they would hear all the sounds, but they wouldn't get the meaning. What's the point of that? Well, again, it's to say that something, that knowledge can be there. It's present in a way, or it's somehow transmitted, but how it's being transmitted, may not be readily apparent. It's going to be a bit of a tricky question, right? So it's easy to think you might have knowledge and you really don't, or you might think that you understand how it moves or how it's transmitted, yet you really don't. So how does, as we might say today, what is the slave reading out a passage? Not only are there sounds, but there's a semantics. There's a meaning that's going on that's somehow behind or underneath the terms and the sounds that are being read out loud. All right, so, and this also is an interesting point, the fact that a slave can read in this time. So it shows a little bit about, in one sense, not all senses, one aspect of Greek slavery. So there was a number of different aspects to Greek slavery. If you're more interested in that, you can have a look at, for instance, Aristotle's first book of the Politics. Talks a lot about slavery and that, and how it's embedded into everyday Greek life. But some slaves were actually quite well educated. So maybe Plato might be saying something like, well, knowledge, maybe the slave does understand what's going on, and so knowledge is a great unifier. So there's the slave, there's Terpsian and Euclides, Euclides is the slave owner, and what links the two is knowledge. So knowledge could be thought, if you say that maybe the slave actually understood the manuscript, then all of a sudden knowledge might be thought of as a kind of unifying force, that knowledge is what brings us together. Or, in other words, put it a little bit more philosophically, that ideas are things that link human beings together. So my idea of something can be the same as what you have. We could be very different culturally, physically, all kinds of things could be different, but our ideas are common. So that's a unifying force. And ultimately that does link up into a lot of Plato's metaphysics, where what ultimately links all of the universe together is a very specific kind and unique kind of idea, which he refers to as the good. So again, always be on your toes with Plato, because he doesn't put extraneous materials in for the sake of it. He's got things in there that we're supposed to pay attention to. All right, so this structural feature of the slave reading is foreshadowing discussions later on that we'll see later on in, you can just make a little note of 163b, so that's for a future reference. We'll come back to this whole issue of sounds and in a more modern sense, syntax and semantics. That will come up later on around 163b. So just, keep that in mind. All right. Now, the last, as we see now, we've got a lot of memory steps. So just a couple more comments on this. We've got a lot of memory steps here. We've got the memory of Euclides, the memory of him talking to Socrates, then Socrates' memory of what happened, the comparisons of memories where Euclides is saying, this is what I remember you said in the encounter with Theaetetus, and Socrates comparing it with his memory. So one of our modes of communication is going to be comparison of memory. So how do we relate to each other? Through memory. All right, so what's Plato telling us about knowledge and memory? And this raises other questions about this kind of structure here in the dialogue. One of the things that's interesting is why does Plato frame it this way? Why does he push the original discussion so far away? Why does he embed it and push it so far away and add all these layers of memory? Yeah, it could be that memory is important. But what's he saying about the central focus of the dialogue, which I haven't talked about yet, but just to jump ahead a little bit, the main dialogue is asking this: what is knowledge? So we'll look in a little bit more there. But Plato is laying the groundwork in one way through the structure of the embedding dialogue, that is, that this main discussion of knowledge is quite removed from us. So in this sense, Plato is probably telling us, by writing in this kind of extended or distancing kind of technique, that the question of knowledge is going to be a tricky one. It's going to be a difficult one. It's not going to be self-evident. And clearly, as we work our way through this dialogue, you're going to see that, as many philosophers and historians have said, that it's one of Plato's most difficult dialogues, and it has a lot of twists and turns through it, and it goes through a lot of previous philosophers' thought. So Plato uses the dialogue also to reach back into the Greek tradition, right, thinkers before him, and try and figure out what they were saying to bring it into his own discussion about knowledge. All right, and of course, the other thing that's that's interesting that also Plato talks a lot about, mainly in the Republic, but it comes out implicitly here, is that there is a link between knowledge and morality. Right? And one of the things is that knowledge has value. Right? Knowledge is something that we value. It is important. That's one sense of kind of the non-neutral aspect of knowledge. But there's another aspect of knowledge that Plato links here more implicitly, but definitely quite explicitly in the Republic, is that knowledge is something that you are obliged to share. In one of his famous scenes in the Republic, when the philosopher somehow gets out of the cave, in Plato's discussion of the cave, the philosopher gets out, manages to find what Plato says is real knowledge outside of the cave. What does the philosopher do? You would think that the philosopher would be thrilled that he or she has found knowledge and would just want to stay outside the cave and live with knowledge and enjoy that. Tempting as it is, that's not what the philosopher does in the example of in the cave, in the allegory of the cave. The philosopher returns to the people that are still trapped in the cave and does his or her level best to convince them that they're actually in a cave and that there's true knowledge if they can escape from the cave. So knowledge creates, knowledge is linked to sharing. In other words, knowledge is linked to obligation. And of course, one of the key ideas in morality is that you have some kind of obligation, some kind of thing you have to do, or as some philosophers would call it, a duty. Greeks didn't talk a lot about duties. As a matter of fact, very little. Aristotle, you can comb through the Nicomachean Ethics, he really doesn't talk about duties. But it's interesting that there is at least an implicit kind of recognition of duty by Plato when he says that with knowledge comes, as we know, responsibility, but comes a duty, and that is your duty to share. Now, the Theaetetus is indeed perhaps one of the most complicated dialogues. We'll see that as we go along. But it's also one of the most rewarding because it is a real romp through the history of Greek philosophy up until the time of Plato. So we're going to meet a whole cast of characters. A little bit of Parmenides. You're going to meet Protagoras, a great thinker. But you got to take it with a grain of salt because it's Plato's version of Protagoras. And we could debate whether or not he really got Protagoras' views correct, but towards the end of the dialogue, as we go, we're going to see some very important ideas, or shall we say philosophical doctrines, that are laid down by Plato in this quest to understand what knowledge is. So in many ways, this is a foundational document in Western philosophy. You have to engage with it in some way. And it's a nice way to look at one aspect of the Western philosophical tradition that is largely referred to, quote unquote, rationalism. And Plato is laying the grounds as to why he thinks that ultimately a kind of rationalism is needed when you want to truly unpack what knowledge is. But on the other hand, one of the things that's really great about this dialogue is it shows that questioning, when you ask like a what is it question, like what is knowledge, these questions don't occur in a vacuum. They have a context, and as we'll see in later videos, how you answer. Like there is not just an answer, but we have to figure out what structure of an answer that we would be willing to accept. Because you can just provide any old answer, and Socrates, as we'll see, doesn't buy that. All right, so now after we've finished this, we should also, this framing dialogue, we should also keep in mind that Plato always was very suspicious. All that I've said earlier that, about writing and things like that. Keep in mind that Plato was suspicious of writing. Think about, and suspicious in deep, profound ways and in just everyday ways. Think of an everyday way that people get into, shall we say, trouble through writing. You send an email. You write something that is kind of funny, or you think it's funny when you write it, might be a little sarcastic or whatever. And then the other person totally doesn't see it that way. And if other people read the email, some people might see the sarcasm, some people might not. So this raises the question of how well the written word captures all the nuances of the spoken word. And, you know, we often say that with respect to humor. Yeah, you had to be there. Or, no, I know I said that, but that's not quite what I meant. You know, when I wrote it, I was thinking of this. So all the subtleties, when you think of how we speak, the written word has difficulties capturing it. And that's why even in this day and age, we still defend many works orally, right? So like if you write a master's thesis or a PhD thesis, you have to have an oral defense. So that's an old nod to the tradition of the text itself can't really defend itself the way that the author can orally. All right, so now we're finished with all this. If you're interested more on Plato and writing, read the Phaedrus. He talks about how you know, writing can be dangerous and it can be interpreted in various ways. Okay, so now what we've got is that the slave is starting to read. We're heading into the main dialogue. Socrates and Theaetetus are coming to come on the stage. We're kicking back with Euclides and Terpsion, and we're listening to the slave read this manuscript. So we're reading somebody's memory-based document. And the first scene, as we'll see, is Socrates walking into the, arriving at a gymnasium, common place for lots of people to interact. Well, the males of Greek society primarily were interacting in there in a gymnasium. And Socrates has his encounter with Theaetetus, and away the dialogue starts. So stay tuned for the next video where we pick this all up and we're engaged with the main dialogue in the gymnasium. Thank you.